Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context video about the Crusades to help you prepare for the fishbowl that we're having in class. So some of this is just almost like a timeline of the Crusades and kind of just some big picture stuff. So as you're reading some of the details, you would be able to maybe put this bigger picture together and add some of the details on your own. The context of the Crusades, there's a few things to keep in mind. There's a variety of different change-ups in the territorial land of the Middle East and of Europe. So just to remind you, kind of post-classical map, right? This is around the 600s, 700s, 800s, into the year 1000. We do have a very large-scale Islamic empire under the Abbasids, for example. This is kind of a very rapid rise of an empire, and to some degree, some of the rapid rise of the Islamic empires lead to a smaller Byzantine empire. So territorially, the Byzantine empire will see some of its former territories, Damascus, for example, fall to the Islamic empire. We also have the kingdom of the Franks, which is Charlemagne's old kingdom. After 800 or so, is going to be politically not very unified. There's a great deal of kind of political winding down and political chaos. So even though we're going to see Europe kind of get economically stronger during the time period after the year 1000 into 1100, and the economy and trade and things like that will start to pick up, there is not necessarily a great deal of political strength. And one of the reasons why we see the church, involved in the Crusades is, due to that. So kind of have some of that just background of some of the changes in the 600s, 700s, and the 800s, okay? This is a map of Spain, and for the most part, we're not really looking at the Crusades as they extend beyond the Middle East, but it's important to note that there are Crusades that happen in Eastern Europe. They also happen in Spain and Portugal, and really important to just have a sense that Christianity is kind of on the rise in Spain in almost like a geographical sense, going kind of from the northern part of Spain, what Christian kind of local societies at first, and then with the help of the church, will ultimately be pushing Muslims and Jews into the southern part of Spain, and kind of what's known as the Spanish Reconquest or the Reconquista. There's an effort to kind of either convert or in some cases remove Jews and Muslims from Spain. And so what was once a really tolerant society declines. And that's kind of seen in the larger picture of the Crusades, this kind of predominance of Christianity in Europe. By the time we reach the era of Columbus in 1492, most of Spain is largely Christian, and individuals who have converted to Christianity, who were Jews or Muslims, are actually tested to see if their conversions are sincere, and that's the Spanish Inquisition. In any case, if we look at the origins of the Crusades in Europe and in the Middle East, keep in mind that when we talk about the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, largely those are like European frameworks. So we're talking about a European start date of a group of Europeans going to, say, Jerusalem and ultimately involving themselves in a crusade. From the Islamic perspective, the timeline is really different. A lot of the activity that exists between some of the Islamic societies and, say, Byzantine happens way before the 1090s, and the Crusades are just kind of another part of what's a much longer picture of territorial disputes between two societies. So it's not necessarily that the Islamic empires receives the Western Crusaders completely as a religious holy war, even though the Western Crusaders may see themselves that way. So that's some of the things that complicate this topic. Important things to note is that in the area of the Middle East, where the Abbasid Empire had been dominating, there's some new players on the block, and they're largely Turkic peoples. One of the groups that's most significant is the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks, will infiltrate into Baghdad, for example, and kind of create a little bit of political kind of control of Baghdad, even during the Abbasid Empire. There's also a very famous battle at Manzikert in 1071. The Seljuk Turks will acquire acquire a great deal of territory from Byzantine. Okay, so from the Byzantine European perspective, Constantinople is right here. There's a great deal of time where the Seljuk Turks are appearing to encroach essentially on the gates of Constantinople, which is a fortified city and won't fall until hundreds of years later to another Islamic group, the Ottomans. The Byzantines are largely seeing the Seljuk Turks as a threat. Okay, part of the context of the First Crusade is largely some Byzantine Empire efforts from Alexius Comnenus to actually reach out to Europeans in places like France to actually assist the Byzantines in an effort to push back the Seljuk Turks. There are times when the Byzantines do gain some of this territory, but the Byzantines aren't necessarily interested in getting the Seljuk Turks out of Jerusalem. They're not interested in protecting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The folks over here who are Christians are largely Roman Catholic. The folks who are Byzantine Christians are Eastern Orthodox. That schism had happened in 1054. So the Byzantines aren't all out to protect Jerusalem, which is all the way over here. They're more interested in getting back their territory, like the city of Antioch. Some of what is going on in the Frankish kingdom is a lot of political strife. There's a great deal of division, and the church is kind of trying to expand its power in kind of a political vacuum. It has an opportunity to do that, and we see the Pope actually calling for a crusade almost as a religious activity rather than the state calling for some sort of, military assistance to help the Byzantine Empire. So it's kind of in this political vacuum that some of this takes place, and we can kind of think about what type of agenda might the church have in getting involved in this, whether it's Pope Urban's specific agenda, or if it's like the church and the power of the church and trying to connect with Byzantine again. Is it about the church kind of expanding their power politically in Europe? Is it about trying to maybe take all of these knights who are fighting and kind of recklessly endangering each other, perhaps getting some sort of unification so that there is a little bit less of the violence of knights on knights within Western Europe? The other important thing to note is that Pope Urban, who is kind of new pope at the time in 1095, does give a rousing speech in Clermont in the Frankish Empire. And in this speech, which you guys have an excerpt of, I just put it there, there's a few things to note. He apparently spoke to hundreds of people and had, great effect. We do not have a transcript of the speech, so a big limitation of any source you look at is nobody knows for sure what Pope Urban said. We have a few sources from people who were saying that they were there, and they recall, some cases decades later, what Pope Urban actually said. So there's probably a variety of different versions of what Pope Urban said. Some of the versions specifically address kind of an us and them framework, where Pope Urban describes the Franks as a single race and the Seljuk Turks as like a vile race that needs to be fought, and that ultimately the Seljuk Turks are defiling Jerusalem, making it not only hard for people to pilgrimage, but there's language in Pope Urban's speech that there's actually defiling of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is significant in Christianity. The version of the speech that you guys have is from Fulcher of Chartres, who is probably a little bit more conservative. So kind of keep in mind as you read it that the language is much more inflammatory in some of the other speeches, but you have a version where you can clearly see Pope Urban using and employing language and also employing some recruitment methods. How does he get people to go on this crusade? And his audience at this speech is largely state officials, so there's people who are part of the government, and there's also religious leaders. And he's hoping to reach out to priests who are parish priests, who are then going to take on his message and recruit people in their own churches, which is exactly what happens. It takes a good 100 years, not even a few decades for this to really take off in a big way, but the very first group is going to be almost like immediately kind of put together to go on this first crusade. But it's something, the recruiting takes place over some time. The significance of Jerusalem, there's many, and just for the purpose of the Christians who are pilgrimaging there or seeking to pilgrimage there. This is about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which to Christians is the place where Christ body was bought after being crucified, and then Christians believe Christ rose to heaven. And the Jews and Muslims also see Jerusalem, of course, as a really significant holy land. One of the really important things is that the Seljuk Turks are new to control of Jerusalem in the time period right before the Crusades, but Muslims in general are not. Jerusalem had been part of the Abbasid Empire for hundreds of years, so it's not like Christians just lost Jerusalem and ultimately are seeking it back. Europeans and the Franks are seeking out Jerusalem to protect it from the Seljuk Turks, but it had been in Muslim hands for years, with Christians pilgrimaging there and no problems at all. So it's kind of interesting that Pope Urban would call out for this. Historians kind of debate why he did that. The Crusades themselves, there's 4 that are primary. There's a great number of them. We won't go into all of them. There's a few things to note. The very first Crusade is probably where we'll focus a good amount of our fishbowl conversation on. It's this red line here. The First Crusade is the first initial group that will travel ultimately first to Constantinople. There is this effort to kind of check in with Alexis Comnenus and to try to ensure that they're going to be assisting. And Byzantine is wildly disappointed at who shows up. They really expect kind of some special op forces. They get this huge ragtag group of people that they don't think is necessarily going to get Antioch back. But the Crusaders, on behalf of Byzantine, and they actually promised to Byzantine, we'll give you the land when we get it. And of course they don't. But the Crusaders ultimately do travel to Antioch. They are successful in Antioch through a siege, which is largely a starvation campaign, kind of a complicated siege thing, but then ultimately they end up in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem becomes then part of what is a 4-part Crusader states. After the First Crusade, European Christians will actually occupy, with castles and all, the Crusader states, which are kind of Jerusalem and some areas north of Jerusalem, all the way up to Edessa. The Second Crusade, largely a failure. Edessa had fallen to the Islamic empires, and the Christians try to get it back. It's a fail. The Third Crusade, where we see Richard the Lionhearted and some other political leaders involved in this crusade, is really to try to affect what has become a great deal of Islamic unity. Under Saladin, as he's referred to in the West, we see kind of a leader who is connected to Egypt start to organize the Islamic peoples under one framework, and we see the takeover of Jerusalem. He and Richard the Lionheart will kind of get into it, and ultimately there's not a huge showdown battle for Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart will pull out before that, so Jerusalem stays in Islamic Empire hands. There is a truce of sorts. Saladin will agree to have pilgrimages by Christians to the area of Jerusalem. However, the Crusades are not over. There is a Fourth Crusade, which is kind of infamous, and we'll get to that in a second. It kind of revolves around Zara and Constantinople. Okay, those particular areas are really, really key with, here's Constantinople, with the Fourth Crusade, kind of Christian on Christian sacking of Constantinople. The First Crusades has a variety of different reasons why people go. In a lot of cases, there's some people without a great deal of money, although it costs a lot of money to go on crusade, so people sell things, variety of things. Lots of people sign up through their parishes in their churches. So entire groups of people from one town will go on crusade. There is an effort to kind of create leadership so that this is going to be largely some type of backwards kind of military effort, but no one is really trained warriors outside of kind of local knights who might be taking up crusades. You also get merchants, you get adventurers, people who are seeking something that Pope Urban refers to, historians argue, something called a plenary indulgence, this idea that sins can be forgiven. People can actually even skip out on this like middle level heaven thing called purgatory, purgatory and actually have sins forgiven. And for some knights that are seen to be fairly violent people, this is very tempting to want to have a plenary indulgence. There is a group of people who don't even wait for like the military effort. The People's Crusade takes off. It's a lot of peasants, people with no arms. It could be as big as 100,000 people. They actually are stopped by a force of Turks at the city of Nicaea, completely attacked and largely not successful. But just to give you a sense of where some individuals like take it upon themselves to go on crusades, there's also an incredible amount of atrocities from the area of France through the area of modern-day Germany. There's horrific stoppages at communities where the European Christians, largely Franks, will take entire groups of Jews hostage and hold them at knife point and do some really, really horrific things. And we see an uptick